Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. It's like we've known each other for so long. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. And those of you watching on the live stream, thank you for joining us. Tonight I'm going to be discussing some topics that are a bit dark, can be triggering for some folks. I just wanted to address transphobia. There will be talk of suicide and homicide. So just as a heads up, if that is something that you might need to leave the room or need to talk about afterwards, feel free and we can discuss that. So tonight's presentation is called Autonomy and Death. Presentation Q&A, trans death care, issues, rights, and actions. Before we get started, I'd like you all to think about some questions that I'm going to ask you. If you died tomorrow, who would be in charge of your remains? Who would make the funeral arrangements? And how would you be dressed, your hair arranged, pronouns used, name, etc.? So I'm just going to let you kind of ruminate on that for a minute. All right. Now I'm going to get into some stories. The first story we're going to talk about is Jennifer Gable. Jennifer Gable was born in 1982. In 2007, she transitioned, changed her name legally on her birth certificate, her driver's license. She lived authentically as herself for about 10 years until tragically she died of an aneurysm at age 30. Now, when Jennifer's friends and chosen family came to her funeral, they were devastated to see their dear friend. Her hair was cut, she was put into a man's suit, her dead name was being used, and essentially the last 10 years of her life had been eradicated. This is because her father, who was her next of kin, was in charge of her funeral arrangements. This was her obituary. The obituary conveniently left out the last decade of her life. It was completely inauthentic to who she was. Her own father essentially erased her true self at her funeral. I have another story for you. Christopher Lee. Christopher was born in 1964. He was a trans man, lived out for 20 years. He had his gender marker changed on his driver's license and birth certificate. He was actually one of the co-founders of the Transgender Film Festival in LA and was known as an activist in his community. Tragically, in 2012, he died at the age of 48. His friend Chino Scott Chun came to pick up his remains, and unfortunately the remains were labeled female with the name Jane. I'm going to say this quote from Scott Chun. Christopher lived his life in all ways as a man for almost 20 years. Misgendering his death certificate erased his history and hard-won identity. I have one more story I'm going to tell you tonight. And this one's a little bit more personal. This is Krona Clairvoyance Gorgon. She was my friend Sky's partner. Krona was an artist, a carpenter, motorcycle and bicycle enthusiast. She was obsessed with quantum physics and just this fantastic woman. Unfortunately, she also suffered from some mental health issues, which were exacerbated by transphobia that she experienced from her family and society at large. Unfortunately, Krona completed suicide in February of 2020. 3 months before her wedding, actually. So once Krona was taken from the coroner's office to the funeral home, her parents, who had disowned her, tried to take as much control away from Sky as possible. Unfortunately, because they were not yet married, Sky had no legal rights to her remains. Sky had to convince them to give them a third of the ashes. Before the cremation, people were allowed to say their last respects to Krona. while Sky should have been the last person to say goodbye to Krona, Krona's family allowed Krona's transphobic ex-partner to be the last person to see her. One thing that is important to note here is that Krona, before she died, had specifically told her friends and the chosen family that she did not want her parents to see her body again, even after she was dead. And she wanted Sky to have complete control over her remains. They had a service in Derby, where Krona was from, where they dead named her. They basically erased her transness to fit their narrative of who they thought their child should be. This was not only devastating for Sky for a variety of reasons, just to lose your partner, especially from such a sudden, tragic death, but also to have it be compounded with the fact that Krona's wishes were not respected, her identity wasn't respected, and then Sky had to fight for Krona's identity with this family, this transphobic family, and ex-partner who ended up having more control over her remains than Sky did. So why does this happen? Why does this occur? It's important for us to note that next of kin body disposition rights, these are the people who are entitled to your remains after you die. It also is compounded by familial discrimination and estrangement. And also rates of homicide and suicide are higher among LGBTQIA+. So first I'll get into next of kin. Oh, sorry. There we go. Next of kin is essentially a blood relative. They have legal right to your remains after you die. There's a line of succession. We have surviving spouse, children, father, mother, brothers, and then, aunts, uncles, cousins, etc. Goes down the line. If there is no next of kin, if next of kin cannot be found, then the state takes ownership of those remains. Now, due to transphobia, homophobia, and discrimination that is often based in religion, biological families don't accept their transgender, queer, non-binary, gender-diverse children. This leads to family estrangement, ostracization, and they're often kicked out of their familial homes at a young age, whether they're teenagers or young adults. This then makes it so that the chosen family, the people who are actually supporting and loving this person, have no legal rights to the decedent's death care. I recently found this from the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. 57% of trans individuals are rejected by their biological families, and 1 in 5 experience homelessness because of this. I'm going to go over some statistics. Trans people, especially trans women, experience more violence than cisgender people. They are at greater risk of homicide. This is from transrespect.org. 375 gender diverse people were reported murdered between October 2020 and September 2021. This is global. This is in the United States. 47 black trans women were murdered this year alone, and those are the ones that we know of because they are often misgendered in the news. 96% of those killed this year globally were trans women or trans feminine. 89% of those killed were people of color, and 43% in Europe were migrants. Center for Suicide Prevention says that 0.5% of the population is trans, and 10% of that population have attempted suicide within the last year. Trans people are 2% more likely than lesbian, bisexual, gay people to attempt or think about suicide. 22 to 43% of transgender people have attempted suicide in their lifetime, and 2/3 of trans youth have attempted self-harm in the last year. Therefore, gender diverse people are more likely to die suddenly by homicide or suicide than cisgender people, which then means that it's unlikely that they have these legal protections in place for their body disposition and funeral arrangements. So what's the impact? Well, first, their autonomy is dishonored at death. The individual fought hard for their identity in life, only for it to be eradicated after their death. We also have misgendering, transphobia, compound the tragedy of the death. This disrespect and lack of care for the deceased makes the tragedy so much worse, and then especially if that death is sudden and tragic already. And then you add in the fact that they are, the chosen family, the partners, are having to fight for that person's identity and death. And it also creates a complicated grief process for those people, for those partners' chosen family. A secure grieving process involves getting to say goodbye to a loved one. By eradicating that individual's identity and death, it further complicates the mourning process, and it sets them back in their ability to grieve. It also would be really disturbing, I think, if you went to go see your loved one and say goodbye if they were dressed up as someone else. This also encourages further discrimination of LGBTQIA+ people. It furthers the idea that sex and gender are the same thing. We know sex means your genitalia, gender means how you present yourself. Denying trans people the right to their identity and death promotes that their identity wasn't valid or worthy in the first place. This is also another element of cis privilege, which further otherizes gender diverse people. So let's get to some happier stuff. What's the solutions? What can we do? So we have My Choice Advanced Directives. They also are called advanced directives in other parts of the country. Some states have what's called an appointment of agent to control disposition of remains. And then we also have LGBTQIA+ protective legislation that is in place in some places. So first we'll look at the My Choice Advanced Directive. This is the one from Montana, state of Montana. Advanced directives contain two documents, living will and medical power of attorney. A living will contains specific instructions about your medical care, whereas medical power of attorney appoints that person to make medical decisions on your behalf after you're incapacitated or unable to make those decisions yourself. This is also known as a healthcare proxy. It's also important to note and to look at what this can do for after-death care. So as you can see, you have your spot where you can say where you would like to die, if you want to donate your organs, but then this right here is really important. You have after-death care. This is where you can put in, what name you want to be used, how you want to be dressed, what you want to be called, as well as, pronouns to be used, those sorts of specifics. In other states, they do have a couple more lines. We'll work on that. Next part is appointment of agent to control disposition of remains. This is from the state of New York. This form is great because it appoints someone as a funeral agent rather than just having control over your health care. So this one gets more specific with funeral arrangements. It also has this great section where you can revoke prior appointments. So those who are your next of kin who you don't want involved, or if there's anyone, maybe an ex-partner or something you don't want involved, you can add, okay, and I really don't want this person to have anything to do with my body disposition. Last thing, protective legislation. We talked about Christopher Lee earlier, the trans man who was misgendered by the coroner. His friends actually went to the Transgender Law Center, and a bill was brought up and ended up coming together into a law called the Respect After Death Act. This is in California specifically, but it says this. Quote, requires the official responsible for completing a transgender person's death certificate to do so in a manner that reflects the person's gender identity if they are presented appropriate documentation, such as written instructions from the deceased person confirming their wishes, an updated birth certificate or driver's license, or evidence of medical treatment for gender transition. Unfortunately, if those things are not available, next of kin will then, whatever next of kin says becomes the default. Christopher's friend, Chino Scott-Chun, who we mentioned earlier, had a great thing to say about when this bill was passed. It brings us great solace to know that Christopher's legacy will live on to protect the dignity of other transgender people, and that their friends and families will hopefully not have to endure what we had to. I have some commonly asked questions. Some of you are probably thinking about these questions right now. What about last will and testaments? Don't those do anything? What is the role of the funeral director? What can the funeral director do? And are these solutions that I mentioned actually enough? So last will and testaments, it's important to note that wills, while a valuable document to discuss your assets, where they're going to go after you die, they are not read until after the funeral. So if you put your funeral